Hey girl gang, it's Dr. Joy here, and you are watching Delivering Joy MD TV. Welcome to Well Woman Wednesday. Today I have a super special guest, and of course, I think all my guests are special, but this particular person is going to educate us today about what is happening in the landscape of women's reproductive rights right now. Most of you know that Roe v. Wade has fallen, and based on what state you live in, your access to family planning and abortion services may be at risk. So today, we're going to talk specifically about that with my expert guest. Make sure you keep watching. We are back, and today I have a wonderful guest that I'm going to tell you a little bit about. She's a native of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and she is a practicing OBGYN physician here in Georgia. She specializes in political advocacy for women's health, and she does a tremendous amount of work for women all across the state. Dr. Adrienne Zertuche is her name. She attended Emory for her undergraduate degree and for her medical degree. I can't even describe all the things in this bio, y'all. She is definitely one of those people who is a high performer and an excellent physician. And I'm so happy to have her to talk to us about this today. Dr. Adrienne and I get to work together for the Georgia OBGYN Society periodically, and she has been working on the response to the fall of Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision, and also the Georgia heartbeat bill. HB 481. She's going to be giving us some great tips today. Hi, Adrienne. Dr. Adrienne, how are you?
Hi, Joy. It's lovely to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited that we were able to make this work because I wanted to make sure that my girl gang is getting the best possible information. So welcome to the girl gang. We've got our girl gang mug here. I don't know if you can see my mug. There we go.
Oh, I love it.
You're kind of always my go-to when I want to know about political things that are happening, what's happening in the legislature in Georgia with regard to women's health. So can you just give us like a little bit of brief background? Like, how did we even get to this place right now? Like, what really happened? I know some of us are waking up and seeing the headlines and thinking, oh my gosh, like what actually happened? How did we lose Roe versus Wade decision?
Well, it's a wonderful question that you raised, Dr. Joy, because we have certainly been through it both here in Georgia and across the United States. I think it's hard to say exactly what the linchpin was. I mean, you could ask a million scholars and you'd get a million different answers. But to kind of cut to the most important recent changes, up until early 2022 in Georgia, women thankfully had a pretty full scope of opportunities in terms of accessing family planning services, whether that meant contraception, planned contraception, emergency contraception, and access to termination. Up until quite recently, termination in Georgia for any reason was legal up until 22 weeks. Unfortunately, with the fall of Roe v. Wade, that called into question one of the more recent legal decisions in Georgia, which was that this heartbeat bill you mentioned previously had been kind of held up in the courts, for lack of a better word. You know, it was passed previously, but there was some question about whether or not it was truly legal, and so it kind of was tucked away by the courts and not allowed to go into effect. And that was why termination of pregnancy was still legal up until 22 weeks. But with the Roe v. Wade overturn and that Dobbs decision that came earlier this summer, that then called into question whether or not our heartbeat bill in Georgia could be permitted to take effect. And unfortunately for the women of Georgia, that decision was made within the courts. And as of just a few weeks ago, House Bill 481 that you mentioned, the heartbeat bill, is now law in Georgia.
Oh, wow. So, for the layperson who may not be well versed in OBGYN care, what exactly does this heartbeat bill thing mean?
It's a great question. What House Bill 481 means for the average woman in Georgia is that if you find yourself in a circumstance where you are pregnant and you no longer want to be, for any variety of reasons. In general, for the majority of pregnancies, after what is described as a heartbeat or some sort of flicker, some sort of cardiac activity is kind of the word that is used in medicine. But if a heartbeat is able to be seen, which generally happens in a normally progressing pregnancy at around 6 weeks along, or about 2 weeks after you've missed your period, it is no longer legal in Georgia to access a termination or to have an abortion. There are some exceptions to that rule, but unfortunately, that is the law of the land as of now.
We work in OBGYN every day, and we know that most of our patients may not even be aware that they're pregnant until after this 6-week mark, or sometimes even later in the first trimester. So for women who maybe don't have regular periods, or maybe they're just extremely busy and they're not really paying attention, so by the time they recognize that a pregnancy has occurred, it may already be too late.
I think the point you raise is exactly the issue with this bill. I mean, even women who are pretty on top of how frequent their periods are, they think that they're on an effective form of contraception. Unfortunately, that 6-week cutoff is so early. It's only about 2 weeks after a potential missed period. And I think that really, it's going to be problematic. We've already seen problems in with my own patients, and I just hurt for the women of Georgia.
I do as well, and I think no matter what side of the issue you fall on, the access to care with a physician should be something that's very personal and private. I don't think that anybody really should be regulating what a woman decides to do with her body and the discussions that she's having with her medical team about that. And that's really probably the scariest part of this for me, is that the patient-physician relationship is being completely disrupted. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you about is about some of those exceptions, because, I think those are very important for people to know. Like, what sort of exceptions to the rule are there?
I would say probably 4 exceptions that are relevant. The easiest one is in the rare circumstance of something called an ectopic pregnancy or a tubal pregnancy. So if a woman finds herself pregnant and the pregnancy is not actually located in the uterus or within the womb, which is where a normal, pregnancy would progress, and it's instead out in her fallopian tube or in a location that it's not supposed to be, in that circumstance, even if a heartbeat is present, it is okay to access the appropriate emergency medical care to have that pregnancy removed or medically treated. In the terrible circumstance of rape or incest leading to a pregnancy, insofar as long as a police report is filed, indicating what happened and who the perpetrator may be, in that situation, termination would still be legal after the 6-week time designation as well. The other 2 exceptions are a little bit harder to understand and to interpret, and honestly, even for us as physicians, there's not really very clear guidelines. One of them has to do with medical emergency. If a woman herself who is pregnant with a pregnancy with a heartbeat, if she is quite ill to the point where we're worried that her life might be at stake or that she might suffer, I believe the text in the bill is irreparable harm, in that circumstance, an abortion might still be legal. And then on the contrary, if the pregnancy is deemed medically futile, so if the embryo or the fetus or the baby that's inside the uterus itself, if we don't think that it is going to have meaningful life outside of the womb, in that circumstance, again, a termination would be legal. But these are hazy and honestly very devastating situations to be in the first place. And so the exceptions, while they're listed there and can be helpful for some women, are still not everything that we would have hoped for the women of Georgia.
I would say that especially those final 2, the medical emergency and medical futility of pregnancy, how do you actually, there's really no guidance for how we can nail those things down and how we can be specific about it. And then, even in considering the rape or incest portion, how many sexual assaults against women go unreported? And if a woman does not feel comfortable coming forward against the assailant, then she's still carrying this pregnancy that maybe was a result from a sexual assault. So there's just so many things that are just not, that they're not the best for Georgia women. And we have been talking about that and thinking about that as a medical specialty, and how we can start to educate our patients. How are you educating your patients that you see every day about what this means for their health and their future and their reproductive life plan?
It's a great question. And I think it circles back to what you mentioned before. This is such a nuanced conversation, right? Choosing whether or not to continue with a pregnancy or terminate a pregnancy has so many more factors than any legislator or government official could ever understand. And you hit the nail on the head earlier when you said this should be a conversation that is between a physician and her patient, because there's so much that goes into making that decision. And so that's kind of what I've been talking with my patients about. You know, I answer their general questions, what's legal, what's not legal, but also remind them that I am here as their physician, and Dr. Joy, that, you know, you are there for your patients as well. That no matter what the circumstance is, how far along they might be in their pregnancy, what's going on in their lives, separate from the pregnancy, what's going on with the pregnancy, that we as physicians remain steadfast to provide compassionate care, to have those difficult conversations, and whether or not it's legal in Georgia, to help them at least make the right decision for them. And if resources, referrals, transfers are needed, to help with that as well. Because it's just a tough spot for anybody to be in, and then to feel as if the decision has to be made for them by the law. That is what really hurts my heart.
Part of what has been very confusing and scary for patients in particular, and even some physicians, is, are there going to be criminal repercussions for people who seek abortion care in Georgia, or if a physician assists a patient with finding a safe place to go for termination services outside of the state? How does that work? And are we seeing, I know for me, I've already seen some patients that are going out of state and coming back. And so that, you know, it's all very complicated. And I think that people are afraid to even bring it up to their physician at times.
I think the fear is so real. And like I said, that's just devastating to me, because, you know, we as OBGYNs are here for our patients, and we want them to feel like they could ask us absolutely anything, including these. And if they're afraid to even come to us, you know, what does that say about where we are as a society and a culture? And you're right, you know, some of that fear is well-founded. There are other states in this country where physicians and women have been or are at severe risk of being criminalized for seeking abortion care, or for referring patients elsewhere, helping them to travel for abortion care. The law as we know it in Georgia does not have those specific stipulations, but certainly patients and physicians are alike are operating with that kind of hanging over their heads. And it'll be interesting and also terrifying to see kind of what happens going forward, because everyone, I think, is just walking a little bit on eggshells until we figure out exactly how everything is going to play out.
I totally agree. You know, when the heartbeat bill first came up, I think it was in maybe 2018, 2019, I was working in a really rural town at that time. And I recall within 6 months or so having 3 patients that had gone to another state, to a place that, you know, in my mind was definitely an unsafe location. The building didn't have a name on it. The person they saw did not identify themselves. It was a gentleman. And I took all 3 of these patients to the OR for emergent, what's called DNCs. And that's when you have an incomplete abortion. And so that was definitely terrifying for me. And I remember the relief that I felt was palpable when this bill got hung up in the courts. But because people had talked about it so much in the news, and people were, you know, talking about it on social media, patients didn't really know what the law was, but they knew that, hey, if I want to seek a termination, I probably need to go somewhere hidden where no one will know. And, that lends itself to all sorts of, botched procedures, people doing things that they are not trained or qualified or licensed to do. And desperate women will do almost anything. So that for me is the most terrifying aspect of this. I understand that there are some folks in Georgia who are attempting to appeal this decision. As a matter of fact, I think I was reading that the ACLU was having a hearing today. In fact, at the time that we're recording this, that they're trying to oppose this bill. What are your thoughts on the likelihood of success with opposing this bill?
It's a wonderful question. My thoughts are very different from my desires. My desires are that the whole thing gets held up again or thrown out entirely. I think, unfortunately, I'm not a legal scholar, so myself and my medical training probably can't comment extensively on whether they're likely to be successful. But I do know that you're right. The ACLU has brought a case, and there are other organizations that are interested in doing the same. As crazy as it is to say, this bill, House Bill 481, the heartbeat bill, has so many different facets to it that actually almost make it a little bit easier to challenge in the courts. For instance, the definition of personhood. There's some tax implications. So, but as broad reaching as the bill was, and as worried as I was about you, like you said, Dr. Joy, when it was first introduced in the courts, it actually poses a few more opportunities for some of these groups that are working to get the bill either piece by piece taken apart or thrown out entirely, because they have multiple different my understanding is ways to challenge it. And I think, for instance, the ACLU case is actually bringing up a piece about the Georgia Constitution and the right to privacy. So only time will tell, but I'm certainly keeping my fingers crossed.
I certainly am not a legal scholar either, but I have been following this case very closely, and all of the updates that you've been sending out to all of our Georgia OBGYNs. And, the Georgia right to privacy seems very interesting to me, because in Georgia, the privacy between the patient and physician is very well protected, and the privacy in general of Georgia citizens has previously been very well protected. And I can certainly see how this bill can violate that privacy. I wanted to ask you about this personhood thing, because this is very confusing. As OBGYNs, we understand that, a baby is not really able to survive outside of the mother, probably before 23, 24 weeks. So this really early heartbeat bill, does that mean that we're saying that this is a fully minted person who has their own right? I mean, it's very interesting. What is your take on it? Because I think about it, and I guess I could see it from both angles, but as an OBGYN and a scientist, I know that this personhood thing is not really necessarily valid, because this is not a person that can sustain life on their own.
I think you bring up an excellent question, and it is incredibly controversial. How any particular person describes when they think life begins can be determined by their faith, by their scientific background, or just by how they've thought things through. And I think that's the trouble partially with this bill, is that they are trying to legally define personhood, which is a very, again, kind of nuanced concept. There are faiths that do believe life begins at conception. We as scientists, like you just described, Dr. Joy, we know that a fetus is not really going to have a meaningful life outside of the womb, at least until it's above 23 or 24 weeks. And I think the implications of putting something down in the law about when a cluster of cells is a person or not, honestly, I think that for instance, the tax folks are scrambling, because all these women who either conceived and miscarried or conceived and had a problem with their pregnancy are going to be claiming kind of dependence on their taxes based on having early pregnancies, which, as defined by this law, mean that they had additional persons or people in their family. I think it raises more questions than we have answers to in this moment, both for patients, for physicians, and honestly for everybody who's working in the government as well.
The way that you just put that just kind of drives it home. It's like, okay, well, I'm pregnant, so if it's tax season, I'm going to claim this dependent real quick so that I can, then if this is a person, then you have every right to claim that child on your taxes. So that's very interesting. But then who's to say that this person will become a legal citizen? Because, regardless of where you are in your pregnancy, we all know the tragic things that can happen. And so now I have a dependent that maybe does not ever become a viable individual. So that's very interesting. In terms of how physicians can be most helpful to their patients and support them, what are some of the things that you would recommend? I know you've been giving some fantastic tips to Georgia OBGYNs just on how they can make these exam rooms and hospitals safer spaces for women, and how they can kind of coach women about their reproductive life plan.
Our biggest role as physicians is to continue to educate our patients and to be there for them no matter where they are, as you mentioned, in their reproductive life plan, whether they're trying for pregnancy, trying to prevent pregnancy, are already pregnant and it's desired or not. Part of that has to do with contraception, right? Reminding our patients that before they even find themselves in a situation where they have a positive pregnancy test that they need to be worried or excited about, if it is not the right time in their life to have a baby, to be on an effective form of contraception and to utilize emergency contraception. In an oops situation, emergency contraception remains legal because it is not what we call an abortifacient. It does not terminate a pregnancy. It just kind of delays ovulation and prevents a sperm from meeting up with an egg. So reminding my patients that those are critical parts of their healthcare, I think is something that's on the forefront of my brain every day when I see them. And then the other, I think, main way to help patients is when they find themselves pregnant and don't want to be, or even if it was a very much desired pregnancy and there's some sort of medical complication for the mom or the baby. For me, I try as much as I can to tuck the legal aspect into the very back of my brain, and to just be a good human and a good physician and counsel them about everything that is going on, help them think through the next steps. And then if termination is something that this woman wants to be on the table for her, just at that moment, bringing forward that we are in Georgia and, discussing the legal aspects of her care, and just helping her to figure out the next best steps.
Absolutely. And I've seen where many hospital systems are kind of putting together these task forces to help families navigate these very murky waters when there is a medical emergency or there is a medically futile pregnancy, or, even if there are like extreme medical conditions. Like I had a patient who had an aortic aneurysm. These are things that pregnancy could completely exacerbate and cause just kind of disastrous outcomes. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is how Black, brown, and poor women will be affected by this law. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question, Dr. Joy. Unfortunately, I think that this law is going to unfairly impact Black, brown, poor, any other marginalized population. What we know in Georgia and nationwide is that men and women of color and of less fortunate, socioeconomic circumstances already suffer poorer outcomes when it comes to healthcare in general, and specifically, maternal and infant morbidity and mortality, or meaning, problems and complications that are diagnosed and even deaths that occur. And laws like this that impact healthcare in general, because remember, abortion is healthcare. Laws like this that impact healthcare impact everyone's outcomes. And so those that already have poor outcomes, whether it's because of later access to care, access to poor quality care, it's going to unfortunately impact them in a greater way.
It's one of the most unfortunate things that I see serving a rural population of women. There was already difficulty accessing termination services, but certainly now I can't even imagine. And, just like you spoke about earlier, being a good human and a compassionate physician, I think about all the time, like, how are my patients going to do with this? And sometimes I'll see patients that come in that are pregnant and they're just, they really are desiring their pregnancy, but they're thinking about the other kids they have. They're thinking about, I just started school. I'm trying to further my education and create more economic opportunities for myself. I just can't do this right now. And, in talking with and walking alongside those patients, I'm really just very concerned about how the impact of this is going to play out on more marginalized women, particularly. So it's definitely a hard pill to swallow, but I really love the tips that you give us about just being a good, compassionate physician and human being, and then dealing with the law aspect of this as you have to. And so that is precisely what I am planning to do. And I hope that most of our OBGYN colleagues are planning to do that as well. And I just want to mention that all of our medical societies, from the American College of OBGYN and the Georgia part of that, all societies essentially have come out and said that they are against this bill, the fall of Roe versus Wade, the limiting of access to care, and the tampering with the patient-physician relationship. So that's just something to note. I know that you've been a part of kind of raising awareness about this and talking about this, within the medical societies. How has that experience been?
It's been a challenging, but also rewarding experience, in the sense that it's murky waters. Like you said, both educating patients and physicians, there's so much unknown, but it's also very, very needed. Everyone right now is kind of grappling from this kind of devastating change in circumstances. And so to have the opportunity to step up to the plate and to help patients and physicians is certainly, it's been humbling, but it's been, awesome as well. And like you mentioned, I mean, all medical societies, I think there was a statement that came out recently, 75 plus medical societies have signed on to a statement that says that, this overturn of Roe v. Wade, bills that have come into place like the heartbeat bill, are just devastating for women, children, families, etc., for the health of our nation. And because of that, particularly within the field of OBGYN, the Georgia OBGYN Society, the American College of OBGYNs have stood strong in terms of trying to fight, to do what we can to make circumstances better, whether that means a full reversal of the Dobbs decision, or just, helping patients meet them where they are. And on that front, I would encourage your patients. There are plenty of resources, and I know you always do a wonderful job counseling them, Dr. Joy, but also directing them to additional resources as needed. And particularly the American College of OBGYNs has really put out a lot of patient-facing resources. My role has mainly been in physician education for some of these nuanced circumstances. How do we navigate the legal implications of this bill? But there's a lot out there for patients too. And obviously continue to seek out Dr. Joy and myself and physicians, but there's publications online as well that can be a great resource.
If you're watching this on YouTube, I'm going to post some of those resources down in the description box, because there are movements all over the country to assist women with family planning services and abortion. The last question, Dr. Adrienne, One of the biggest conversations that I've heard since the Dobbs decision is that, people are very concerned about what happens next with contraception rights for women. Can you comment on that briefly before we wrap up?
I would just say that as of right now, contraception in Georgia across the country is legal. And that includes all forms of contraception, things that are easily reversible, like pills, patches, rings, things that are a little bit longer acting, like IUDs and Nexplanons, even sterilization, and emergency contraception, which is over the counter. As far as we know, there is no movement, no viable movement at this time to withhold that right from women and men to access contraception. That said, we never thought we'd find ourselves where we are with abortion care. But I hope in my heart of hearts that is not something that we have to worry about going forward. It's hard to predict. I would just say as of right now, everything contraception-wise is legal, and I hope it stays that way.
Me too. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me. We really appreciate your expertise, and I know that folks watching will get a lot of information out of this. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing across the state and in our national arena to help women achieve lives where they can be healthy and thriving and making good decisions for themselves and their families. So we'll catch you guys next time, Girl Gang. Peace.